Good morning, everyone. Bon matin à tous. My name is Michelle Duffy, and I am the Vice Chair of the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Moncton's Board of Directors. It is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day. This keynote speaker actually needs very little introduction for anyone who follows economic data in New Brunswick. David Campbell is president of Jupia Consultants, one of the foremost economic analyst firms in Atlantic Canada. He was formerly chief economist with New Brunswick Jobs Board Secretariat. He has more than 25 years experience in economic development related roles, working with industry, not-for-profit organizations, and governments across Canada. David's work can be seen in the Greater Moncton Local Immigration Strategy, the Southeast Labor Market Partnership, and new work to identify priority growth sectors for Southeast New Brunswick. David holds an undergraduate degree in finance and a master's in business administration from Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. He's also completed programs from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, the University of Waterloo, and the University of New Brunswick. We will have time for a Q&A with David at the end of his presentation, so please submit your questions using the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So to give us an overview of where we are at and perhaps where we're headed, as we reach the one-year mark of COVID-19 and its impact on our economy, please welcome David Campbell.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm glad to be here. I hope everybody can hear me. It's always a little bit tricky when we do these Zooms. So I'm going to share my screen now. I've got a slide deck I'd like to take you through quickly. This should only take about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time at the end to try and answer any questions you might have about the state of the economy here in Greater Moncton and across New Brunswick. I'm going to focus mostly on New Brunswick this morning. There's a few slides in there specifically related to Greater Moncton, but as was mentioned in my introduction, I've been doing a lot of analysis of the economy here in the Moncton region, so I could try to answer any questions you might have. So we're really talking about the state of the economy emerging out of COVID-19. So we don't know exactly when this is going to be over or if it's ever going to be fully over. There's lots of debate about how COVID-19 might linger as an ongoing but managed challenge for the global population. So we'll talk a little bit about where things are now and hopefully where things could end up and some of the risks that I see associated with COVID-19 from an economic perspective moving forward. So there's basically four themes to this presentation. One is the current state of the economy in New Brunswick. The second part is what I call the COVID-19 hangover, and that is, will we have these challenges moving forward that are associated with the pandemic that we've been going through over the past year? The third part of the presentation I call the Roaring 20s, which is basically related to the potential opportunities that we might see emerging from this or after this pandemic. And then finally, the outlook for New Brunswick in general. I've got a few thoughts on that as we move forward. So what's the current state of the New Brunswick economy? Well, I think everybody realizes the economic impact of COVID-19 in the province was not as severe as it was in most other Canadian provinces and other OECD countries. So that's not to suggest we didn't have a challenge, right? Real gross domestic product fell by an estimated 4.2%. That's the folks at RBC Economics. Others forecast a little higher or lower, but basically we're looking at about a 4.2% drop in the size of the economy in 1 year, and that's the largest single year decline in GDP probably since the Depression, so certainly a serious drop of GDP. Also, the rest of Atlantic Canada, if you look at Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador, similar rates of GDP decline, and for all Atlantic provinces, again, because of this somewhat of a bubble we had in the region, our GDP only fell by 4.2 compared to almost 6% across the country. So obviously that's directly related to the state of the pandemic across the country. So if you look at the actual performance, and I just updated these numbers this week, Atlantic Canada wide is home to about 64 out of every 1,000 people in Canada that actually got COVID-19. but we're home to 64 people out of every 1,000 living in Canada in total, but we only account for less than 5 out of every 1,000 COVID-19 cases since the beginning of the pandemic. So that's significantly less. That's an order of magnitude less people have contracted COVID-19 in this region. And that is in large part why we've performed relatively better than the rest of the country. But again, I want to reiterate, the economy was still hit hard. The lost GDP in 2020, so that's the growth that we were expecting in 2020, plus the GDP loss that I just talked about, is equivalent to about $2 billion wiped off the New Brunswick economy in 1 year. So on a $30+ billion GDP, that's a big hit to the economy. Most forecasters are now expecting it'll take roughly 2 years just to get us back to where we were in 2019. So this comes on the heels of over a decade of weak economic growth in New Brunswick. So really, the timing of the pandemic was particularly challenging for us in New Brunswick. So in terms of employment, again, the picture is much better here than it is in the rest of the country. If you look at the numbers in January of 2021, that should read, not 2020, employment overall is only down by less than 1%, less than 0.5%, 0.3, compared to a drop of 4.4% across the country. So that's a big difference between the decline in employment here versus the rest of the country. And again, it's important to note that this would be much, much worse without the federal government support through the Emergency Wage Benefit Program and also the CERB program. So the unemployment rate was up only modestly this year compared to last year. So 8.8% across New Brunswick compared to 7% last year. It's nearly 13% across Canada in January of 2021. There were, however, 17,000 more people collecting employment insurance in New Brunswick in November. That's the last month we have. So there's about 60,000 people now in November that were collecting employment insurance in New Brunswick, and that's up 39% over November of last year. So certainly a big increase in the number of people collecting employment insurance. So there were some sectors hit pretty hard. We talked about restaurants earlier in this program. The tourism industry was hit hard here, but not as hard as most other provinces. So if you look at the December numbers, the tourism unemployment rate across New Brunswick was 9%. And these are data from Tourism HR Canada, compared to just under 15% across Canada. So certainly a much lower unemployment rate in the tourism sector. Tourism employment dropped 8% year over year. So that's a decline in December compared to December of last year. But it was the lowest decrease among the 10 provinces in Canada. So if you look at the numbers here, this is December 2019 compared to December 2020. And again, so the whole country took a hit in tourism employment, but most of the provinces out west and Quebec and even Nova Scotia took significant declines in tourism, whereas we had only a modest decline in tourism and the drop in tourism employment. Now, but it's important, again, to put that into context. So even though we had an Atlantic bubble in the summer, tourism activity was down significantly in 2020 compared to 2019. So province-wide accommodation room sales was down 64% year over year. And that's March through December of the year. The New Brunswick Aquarium and Marine Center in St. Andrews, visitors were down 72%. The New Brunswick Museum in St. John, visitors were down 88%. The Village Acadien visitors were down 79%. So the reality is, in the data, we're seeing New Brunswickers did more outdoor recreation, but did not spend as much time on spending on tourism activity or overnight stays. So we were out and about a lot more, but we weren't spending a lot of money on tourism, particularly on overnight stays. Southeastern New Brunswick was hit particularly hard. So room sales here were down 70% year over year. Hopewell Rocks visitors down 85%. Outdoor venues other than Hopewell Rocks were not hit as hard. So Fundy Park was only down 30% in terms of the number of annual visitors. The Fundy Trail was only down 39%, and Kujabaquak Park was only down 21%. So again, people were getting out, they were engaging in outdoor recreation, but not spending as much on hotels, restaurants, and other tourism activities. So just a few more slides related to this. So this is the change in employment by month comparing 2020 compared to 2019. So you can see, just like everywhere else in Canada, when the lockdowns hit hard in April and then May, really saw a big decline in employment. And again, this was with 60, 70, 80,000 people supported by the Canada Emergency Wage Benefit in those months. So certainly that would have made it much, much worse. We would have saw probably a decline in somewhere around 1/3 of the entire workforce without the support from government. So that was very much appreciated. And you can see the numbers improved through the summer, and actually are basically roughly the same in November, December, January as they were last year. Again, with that caveat that there's still thousands of people supported in New Brunswick through the Emergency Wage Benefit Program even now. If you look at the employment and food services sector, this is the percentage change. Again, it mirrors very much what we saw in the employment across the board. So big drops in April, May, and getting better in the summer. And then through the fall and winter, roughly the same as last year. And again, a lot of that being buffered by the support from the federal government, allowing companies to keep employees on the payroll, or otherwise these numbers would be significantly worse. So it's very important not to put too much stock into this as a direct indicator of the decline in the accommodation and food services sector. So this is the number of employees covered by the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy in New Brunswick. And I will say that we actually, unlike a lot of federal government programs, we actually received a lot less per capita from the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Program than most other provinces, because of how well the economy did, relatively speaking. But you can see here, as I said before, in April and May, you had 65 to 70,000 people supported by this program, where money flowing directly into firms. And that only started to tail off in the fall. And the last period we have data on is November 22 to December 19. And there were only about 8,400 still supported by that program. So certainly throughout the bulk of this pandemic, many employers were supported through this program. I think it's about $700 million that flowed directly just through this program, not including CERB and other programs. So the other thing we track is job postings. So we want to understand what's going on in the labor market as a result of COVID-19. So this is a company called Vicinity Jobs, which tracks the number of unique online job postings by month. And you can see here, this is going all the way back to January of 18. You can see here the significant decline again in the first part of the year, with it really cratering in April. And then you start to see it coming back, but it really hasn't returned back in 2020 to the levels we saw in 2019. And in fact, we were on a downward trend province-wide since 2018. So we're not 100% sure why we're seeing a decline in the number of online unique job postings, but certainly we did see some return to normalcy after the first quarter of 2020, but still quite soft compared to historical precedent and also compared to what we're seeing in other provinces. So this is by sector, the change in job postings between May and December. So this would be out as we come out of the worst of the pandemic. So between May and December compared to the same period in 2019, you can see the healthcare sector has seen a big increase in the number of job postings over that period, whereas most sectors have seen pretty significant declines. If you look at the IT sector, which is one that's concerning to me, we've seen a 57% decline in the number of unique job postings in New Brunswick in May to December of this year, of 2020, compared to May of December of 2019. If you look at the overall professional, scientific, and technical services sector, job postings are down 55. Finance and insurance jobs down nearly half, manufacturing down 35, and across all industries down 31%. And don't worry about writing all this down. If you want this, a copy of this slide deck, we can certainly provide that to you. So this is really showing us that we have a softening in the job postings, which may be an underlying indication of a lack of hiring among the businesses in the economy. Okay, just a few more slides here, and then we can open it up to Q&A. So this is the value of building permits issued. Now, it's very important to know that in a normal recession, you see a big decline. You tend to see a big decline in construction activity. So people retrench, companies retrench, governments and institutions retrench as a result of the recession. But this was a different recession on many fronts. So if you look at the value of building permits issued in 2020 across New Brunswick, it was actually about the same as it was in 2019 at $1.14 billion worth of building permits issued. In fact, residential building permits went up by 31%, almost $750 million worth of residential building permits issued in 2020. Industrial and commercial, as would be expected, saw a fairly steep decline in the value of building permits, whereas institutional and government value of building permits actually went up significantly in New Brunswick in 2020. So what this means now is we're actually seeing some tightness in the construction workforce, and it's getting hard in some parts of New Brunswick to find construction workers, and there are delays in some projects. And why that matters is because normally coming out of a recession, governments would invest in infrastructure and construction to try and stimulate the economy, but that might be trickier this time because of the challenges, potential challenges with the construction workforce. So the other thing that Stats Canada started publishing data on in the last year was, and they call this experimental, but it's basically business openings and closings by month. This data is available at the provincial level, but also at the census metropolitan area level. And all it means is when they talk about a business opening or closing, the business opening is a business that submitted information, their payroll information to CRA, where they went from 0 to 1 or more employees, or if they closed, they went from 1 or more employees to 0 employees. So it's not an indication of bankruptcy. It's not an indication of permanency of the closure. It's an indication of firms or businesses or business locations that actually did not have any payroll or any staff during the month. And then in the next month or the subsequent month, they might have started up again. So you can see here, this is going all the way back to January 15. You can see here there was this huge spike again in the first quarter in March and April of 2020. And that rapidly decreased and came back more or less to something that looks pretty similar to the historical norms between opening businesses and closing businesses. And again, I'll just reiterate that those opening businesses mostly were the businesses that were closed before and they were opening again. So it's not necessarily new businesses opening. But you can see we went back to some kind of normalcy after that big spike in March, April, May. So what are these potential COVID-19 hangovers that I was mentioning earlier? So these are what I think are some of the challenges we have to keep our eye on. And the first one is, what if COVID-19 sticks around? There's been a lot of stories in The Economist and other magazines suggesting that we might see this pandemic linger for a variety of reasons, even after there's broad-based vaccination. Because of the timing of vaccination around the world, but also some segments of the population are not planning to get vaccinated, and so other issues related to vaccination. And so there's some thought that this could stick around, almost like a seasonal flu, coming back in spikes and different levels of intensity around the world on an ongoing basis. So we have to think about what that could mean for the economy. Potential structural decline in local entrepreneurship. So the CFIB is suggesting we could lose upwards of 1/3 of local independent businesses. We already know that about 40% of our entrepreneurs or our business owners are over the age of 55 right now in New Brunswick. So if a lot of those decide to exit and not come back into the business world, are there enough younger entrepreneurs ready to step up in the province, or will we look at a structural decline in local entrepreneurship? And if we do, what does that mean to competition? What does that mean to prices? What does that mean to innovation? So I think this is an issue we're not thinking about as much as we should be right now as we look to come out of COVID-19. There should be a very strong public policy focus on ensuring we have vibrant, dynamic, and competitive local economies. And the way you do that is by having a good mix of large firms, new entrants, existing firms, and locally owned businesses. A real challenge could be a sustained slump in tourism activity. I'm concerned about our customer service, our back office sector. So if you look at companies like WestJet, which closed their operations here, ALC, Sitel, There's been a number of firms that have either closed or scaled back the number of people doing back office activity, particularly here in Greater Moncton, but across the province. And the question is, now that those workers can work anywhere because of this new focus on remote work, will we see that sector bounce back? Will we see the thousands of jobs lost potentially in this sector bouncing back after this pandemic recedes? So you have Air Canada has one of their national call centers in St. John. You have many hotel back offices, Wyndham Worldwide in St. John. We have Accor and others here in the Moncton region. So the question is, will that come back? And I think we need to keep a very close eye on that. What will be the impact of the remote workforce? So we'll talk about that as a positive, but it's also a potential negative, as New Brunswick firms, or firms that have New Brunswick operations now, could hire workers across the country. And when you talk to business owners in New Brunswick, a number of them have started hiring at least specialized staff all over Canada and even beyond. And so that's a real challenge, I think, in the longer term. And then finally here, the impact on immigration and international students. So we were really trending upward in Greater Moncton. We were breaking our annual targets. If you looked at the first 2 months of 2020, we were on track in 2020, again, to have a very, very good year for immigration, both here in Greater Moncton and across the province. And we ended up with a really big hit, right? So about 50% decline across the province, not quite as steep here in Greater Moncton. And of course, the international student population also was hit pretty hard as a result. And so the real issue is, can we get back to sustained immigration and back to increasing the number of international students in post-secondary education? So what about the Roaring 20s? So an author has posited that one of the reasons why the Roaring 1920s was so roaring in terms of cultural explosion and innovation and so on was because of the pandemic of 1918 and 1990. And so will we see the same thing across North America and around the world coming out of this pandemic? We'll see. Our challenge here is to figure out what it means for New Brunswick, and particularly our economy and population. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I think there is potential to attract remote workers. Opportunities, New Brunswick and 3+ here in Greater Moncton and other partners are working to promote New Brunswick as a place. If your job can be done from anywhere, why not do it from New Brunswick? We have very little exposure to pandemics. We have very little earthquake and hurricane and any of the other major issues. The only thing here in New Brunswick is you have to be able to handle long winters, but we're getting pretty good at that here in New Brunswick. I think there's opportunities for specific strategic industries. So the federal government would like to see us more self-sufficient in minerals, in some of the food supply chain, certainly in biosciences. The lack of vaccination capacity or manufacturing of vaccines in Canada is a real concern, but that can also extend beyond vaccines to other strategically important components in biosciences and medical technology. So the federal government and the provincial government, I think, is interested in these strategic industries. And so our challenge here in New Brunswick is to say, how do we take advantage of those? What potential minerals do we have that could be mined? What kind of agricultural and local food supply chain opportunities do we have? And do we have opportunities in biosciences here in the province? A number of our firms have actually done quite well, like Lumen Ultra out of Fredericton, providing a needed service as a result of this pandemic. Growing the population, I think we can double down on this. We can continue to position this province and this urban center as a safe place to move, to build your career, to raise your family, and ultimately to retire. We have a limited pandemic risk. We proved that with COVID-19, but also across a variety of other elements, crime rates, and so on. This is just a really, really good place to live, and I think we need to continue to promote that. And then what I call here cooped up in Canada, as tourism does start to open up, I think it's going to open up within the province, within Atlantic Canada, and then within Canada first, before we see a big increase in international tourism. So our challenge as a provincial tourism industry is to make sure we're attracting when tourism starts to come back, and hopefully that will be this summer, we're attracting a lot of that activity here in New Brunswick and in Greater Moncton. So just a couple of slides on the outlook, and then we can open it up for questions. So RBC Economics is forecasting a 4% real GDP growth rate in 2021 and 3.8% in 2022. This is pretty similar to some of the other forecasts agencies, Conference Board of Canada and others. So really we're looking at, as I said before, getting back to where we were before and maybe slightly ahead by the end of 2022. So these are good news. It will require a rebound in household spending, and it will require a return to business investment and growth in our export focused sectors, which is what is of concern to folks like me. So for New Brunswick, we need to get back on track. There were green shoots pre-COVID-19. We had 26,000 added to the population between 2016 and 2020. Modest GDP growth over that period after a long period of stagnation. We had record levels of immigration. The information and communications technology, after a number of years of stagnation, had been growing strongly in the last few years, both in terms of its GDP contribution and employment, and even tourism was trending in the right direction. If you go back to some of the challenges we saw after 9/11, we might require government stimulus. And the good news is the provincial government here is probably in better shape than almost every other province. So we have opportunity to encourage industries to invest and grow in the short term, encourage households to spend again in New Brunswick and maybe across the Atlantic bubble. As I said before, we need to foster more entrepreneurship. We need to make that a major priority. We need to invest in strategic economic development infrastructure. That could be things like rural broadband, or maybe it's time to invest in things like the New Brunswick Museum or other economic development related infrastructure. And then a key priority for me is to ensure the air transportation system gets back to normal. There's a lot of people suggesting, we'll have far fewer flights and far less choice after we come out of COVID-19. And I think that would be a huge mistake. Let's at least attempt to build back to the same as we saw before the pandemic. In Greater Moncton, as I said before, we're particularly exposed to services-based exports. So we need to make sure that we're focused on that sector and seeing rejuvenation in that sector moving forward. We're also more exposed to the tourism sector. We have one of the strongest tourism sectors in the country among urban centers, and many of our hotels continue to run at very low occupancy. If you look at food manufacturing, transportation, and warehousing, these sectors are still well positioned to do well moving forward. This region has to focus on immigration and international students. And we also, as well as the province, need to get back on track. We were on a very good run. This area had the second fastest population growth rate last year of any metropolitan area east of Oshawa. And we need to continue that positive momentum moving forward. So with that, I'll end my presentation, and I think we've left at least 10 minutes or so here for questions.
Thank you very much, David. That was a very good overview of the economy. I will remind everyone that they can ask questions using the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and we've already had quite a few questions come in, so we'll definitely be able to fill the time. So to start off, David, what economic sectors do you see recovering the quickest, and which will be the slowest to recover from this pandemic?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what we're looking at in terms of whether it's Greater Moncton or province-wide. But I think province-wide, household spending, so all of the sectors around personal services and retail, I think those are going to hopefully come back fairly strong. Again, so much of it depends on vaccination and where we're standing on that front, right? So the Prime Minister continues to tell us we'll be vaccinated within a few months, maybe by middle of the year. Now others are predicting it'll be 2022 and maybe mid 2022 before we're all vaccinated. So I think that has a lot to do with it. I'm concerned about our export sectors. The paper sector took a real hit in 2020, but the sawmill sector did very, very well. So we're seeing a mixed bag on forest products. So I think the consumer-led sectors should come back as we see COVID-19 recede. And our focus needs to be making sure those export sectors, whether it's food, whether it's forest products, whether it's services, in the particular case of Greater Moncton, we need to be very focused on our service industries, making sure they come back post-COVID-19.
Okay. As a human resources professional, this question is really important to me. What has COVID-19 done to our workforce needs? Will remote work permanently change our labor supply and demand?
So I'm not an expert in that area. My hunch would be, from reading the various articles on it and looking at the trends, is that it will become more permanent, but it will not necessarily be pervasive. I think what we're finding is, after a year of this, is that employers are missing some of the benefits of having a co-located workforce in one single place. And I had breakfast actually with a couple of managers just last week, and they said early on in the pandemic, they saw productivity rise after the introduction of remote work, but it actually has gone down since then. So I think probably we'll see a mix. We'll see employers being more flexible if people have to stay home and work remotely. And I think we will see some rise in the permanent remote workforce. And again, that's particularly concerning for Greater Moncton, because a lot of our customer service agents, that in the past were working, say, in downtown Moncton, now could work anywhere. They could be working in Sudbury, Ontario. So I think that's a real risk for us specifically moving forward.
Okay. So we have a question from Susie Campos, the CEO of 3 Plus Corporation. Why do you think there has been a big increase in the collection of EI? Is it because of the loss of jobs in the hospitality, retail, and restaurant sector?
No, well, yes and no. So the reality is that when they closed the CERB program, people were moved to this, what's called an enhanced employment insurance. So that's why there's a big increase. So it's basically the leftover people that were still collecting the CERB. They are now collecting what's called, or what's being termed, an enhanced employment insurance program.
Let's see, our next question is from Bernard LeBlanc, the CEO of the Greater Moncton Airport. His question is, as we approach summer 2021 and see little movement in regards to reopening of borders or lessening of travel restrictions, what is the expected impact on hospitality and tourism sector? Is it the same as 2020, better, or worse?
So a lot of that will do with the Atlantic bubble. So there is talk of potentially doing what we did last summer and actually opening them up the 4 provinces, but a lot of that will do with the lingering cases of COVID-19. So I would suggest the outlook right now isn't particularly good. Probably if we get as good as last year, I think we'll be doing well, unfortunately. But again, that all depends on how quickly people get vaccinated. But I would suggest, if for forecasting purposes, I would suggest that if we get up to last summer's output and activity this summer, I think that would be a good outcome. And then hopefully that'll start to pick up later on in the summer and into the fall. And we'll actually hopefully start to see even business travel start to come back a bit as we get widespread vaccination. But again, a lot of that will depend on the timing, right? There's still, one of the things that's I've been concerned with or struggling with is, at what point do we start to open things up nationally? So do we wait till every single person is vaccinated, or do we just wait until all of the most vulnerable people are vaccinated? So I think this is an issue, and we haven't got good results or good feedback from government on this. But my sense is, here in New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada, there's still going to be a pretty tight clamp on movement, and that will negatively impact the tourism sector.
I agree. Okay. Our next question is from Marc Lapointe. Why are the tourism job loss numbers so different between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia? Do they point to the lack of outside visitors to New Brunswick versus Nova Scotia?
That's a really good question. So the reality is, New Brunswick is not as reliant on external tourists. We actually spend a lot more outside the province every year than tourists from outside the province spend here. So we actually have what's called a tourism trade deficit. So in fact, if New Brunswickers spent all their tourism dollars, they didn't go to New York or Toronto, they spent them all in New Brunswick, we could theoretically have a larger tourism, a tourism output here than we would in another year. But of course, we don't do that, because that's not the way things work. But I would suggest that's a big part of the difference. And then part of it might be timing, part of it might be accessing, EI and CERB and the CEWS program. I'm not sure, but that was certainly stuck out for me as well, this difference between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in particular.
Okay. Our next question from Maxime Gauvin. What opportunities do you see in the local food industry and what needs to be implemented provincially and locally to boost this sector?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of agriculture and local food production. You know, it's a little bit more expensive than the mass-produced food, but I think the public is demanding more of that, and we are starting to think more around food safety. So we're never going to be food self-sufficient in New Brunswick. It's just not the way things have gone nationally. But I think if we could see more local food, more local production, I think that would be a good thing for the local producers, a good thing for the economy, and a good thing for the population. Now, what we need to do is ensure we have enough farmers, for example, on the periphery of Greater Moncton, but around the province. So our farmers, over half of our farmers are over the age of 55 and heading toward retirement. We have lots of fallow agricultural land around the province. So I'd like to see a renewal of our farm sector, attracting more farmers and encouraging more young people to get into farming. And then looking at some of those value adds. We talked about that a little bit this morning in the earlier panel, which is very exciting. And I think if we saw more of that type of activity, but I mean, it's all a question of risk and effort and finding the right types of people that want to do that kind of work. But I think there's a real opportunity if we can find the entrepreneurs and the farmers that want to get engaged in that sector. I think there's a real opportunity to see growth there in the coming years.
There's so much of this theme of buy local, be local, right? Our next question is from Victor Boudreau of M5. At a macro level, are you aware if food producers are dealing with issues of surplus inventory because of the slowdown in the food and hospitality sector?
So again, that depends on whether they're serving the local market or the export markets. I think the local market is fairly good. Some of the export sectors, some of the fish and so on, and some of the bigger agricultural products in the export market, the markets have been quite soft. So I don't have any specific sectors to discuss this morning, but I would say in general, it's still a difference between those export-oriented sectors like fish and blueberries and potatoes and so on, versus the local sectors that local food production here in New Brunswick.
Okay. Our next question is from Ted Godet. We see an increase in numbers of families moving to Greater Moncton from larger cities in Canada. How can we create incentives to accelerate this either through government or local community involvement?
So this is very interesting. So we're actually not seeing that in the data. So we are seeing it anecdotally. We're reading stories of U-Haul trucks lined up here because there's nobody going back the other way. And in my neighborhood here in Greater Moncton and in downtown Moncton, a number of people have moved in. So it's visceral. We're seeing it. The real estate agents are seeing it, but we're not actually seeing it in the numbers yet. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Either there's a problem in the calculation or it's just more visible to us because we're noticing it more because we're all sitting in our homes. But I would say in general, we need to promote this region. We need to promote the province for this type of work. People are starting to realize that maybe they want a little slower pace of life. They don't necessarily want an hour-and-a-half commute to work. They don't necessarily want to spend $1 million to get a 3-bedroom bungalow. And so when that happens, when they start to think like that, communities like Greater Moncton are a perfect opportunity for them. Now, having said that, I do work across 6 Canadian provinces, and places like Kingston are also doing the same thing. They're running billboard ads in downtown Toronto. We know there's a number of communities in Southwest Ontario. Halifax is pushing hard. Prince Edward Island is pushing hard. So everybody's going to go after that cohort of people that are thinking about moving to a smaller urban center or a rural area. And so we're going to be in high competition. So that's why I suggest it could be a risk as well as an opportunity. We need to make sure we're competing. In the United States, there's jurisdictions that are giving upwards of $10,000 in cash grants for people that actually agree to move to their community. And we're not seeing anything like that in New Brunswick, although in St. John, there's a program that offers free office space for remote workers. So these are the kinds of things. If we want to compete in that space, we need to not only promote ourselves, we need to also make sure we're a competitive place, maybe even tax rates, right? And things like that. We need to think about what would compel or attract a person to look to a place like New Brunswick to move if they can pick up and move from wherever they are now.
Okay. We have a question from representatives of the town of Sackville. How do you think smaller towns in rural New Brunswick fit into the recovery plan? And what should we do?
So I think that most rural areas, the challenges won't change. So before the pandemic, demographic challenges were hitting our rural areas harder. Some of our export industries, natural resource-based industries, agriculture, forestry, and so on, there were challenges. So I think coming out of COVID-19, we're facing the same challenges. So a place like Sackville or Woodstock or any of these smaller communities, St. Stephen, they need to get back to what they were trying to do before, and that's ensure there's enough workers living in their community to meet the labor market demand, or those export focused sectors will not grow. And that again, that's agriculture, that's anything natural resources based. So we got to get back to the fundamentals of trying to grow population and our key industries around the province. I don't think COVID-19 is particularly negative for smaller communities. And in fact, because of this trend toward remote work, as long as these communities have good broadband, it could actually be a benefit for places like Sackville.
Okay. We have a question from Pauline Roy. I'm the director of the Entrepreneurship Center at the Université de Moncton, and every year international students are very interested in our programs and services. There doesn't seem to be many services in the community, however, to help the transition from international students who are on temporary visas to local business owners as immigrants. Is this your view as well?
So we were just talking about this yesterday. There's a working group looking at entrepreneurship and immigration here in Greater Moncton, and we were talking about that, and that I think that's going to be an even greater priority moving forward. I don't want to speak on behalf of this committee, but I think there's a real understanding of what was just said, that a lot of these international students have entrepreneurial aspirations, and we need to find ways, both in terms of the technical process, how they get the right visas, how they get the right ability to actually start businesses, but also then supporting them as they look to open new businesses and buy existing businesses here in the Greater Moncton area. So I think that's a really good point. And as I talk about renewing our base of entrepreneurship here in Greater Moncton, I think the university and those international students are going to be a key part of that renewal.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. From a recovery standpoint, are the financial assistance programs that you think the federal and provincial government should be focusing on for the rest of 2021?
I think they need to be more targeted. I think, as we heard this morning, this is hurting some sectors other than others. And when I talk to the accountants in New Brunswick, a lot of folks have applied and received funding under some of these programs, even though they're having kind of a record year for profits. So I don't want to get into a big discussion about that, except to say, moving forward, I'd like to see these programs targeted as much as possible to the sectors that have the most need, whether it's restaurants or accommodations or other types of services that have been negatively impacted by the lockdown, right, and the restrictions on activity. So I think they're the right programs. I just think we need to make sure they're targeted and they're sufficient to ensure that the hardest hit industries, air transportation is a good one, but certainly the others that we talked about already this morning.
Okay. And if you had one piece of advice to give the business owners that are listening this morning as they continue to grapple with COVID, what would it be?
I feel bad for business owners, right? They have to deal with market risk and labor market and workforce issues and competition. And now we throw on pandemic risk on top of everything else. So what's that? Is that a 2% risk premium on your capital invested? So I feel bad for business owners. But at the same time, those that come out of this could come out of this stronger. As I said before, if there's less competition around, the ones that actually survive will actually be in a better position moving forward. So I would say for as many as possible, hold on, lobby hard to get the support needed for the industries that are most affected. But I think if you can hold on and get through this pandemic, you should be well positioned moving forward.
Okay. I think that's all the questions that we have. So David, I'd like to thank you for your time this morning and for your expertise in providing us with a great overview of where our economy stands and the challenges we face.
Happy to help.
It's now time for our next break. We'll be back in about 10-15 minutes for our second keynote speaker, so stay tuned. Thank you.